Okay, so continuing on with Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, we're on chapter 3 here. And he begins chapter 3 by saying that in order to understand all this, it becomes necessary to look at Apollonian culture and to analyze it, to look at the beauty of all the gods depicted on the lintels and the reliefs. Apollo is not even separated out from them, even though it is a creation of Apollonian dreaming vision. Myth is basically a culture dreaming while awake. That's the Apollonian side of it. And he says that this whole Homeric world of the Olympians is magnificent and majestic and beautiful to behold. This is a real great celebration of life here and the grandeur of being when we look at the Homeric epics or just look at the Olympian pantheon altogether. Keep in mind that Dionysus was not an Olympian god. He was never allowed onto Mount Olympus. And so he gets into this interesting paragraph here where he says, now, what does folk wisdom have to say about all this joyful Apollonian exuberance regarding life? And he says that there's a myth regarding King Midas who was out hunting the companion of Dionysus, Silenus. They finally caught him. And King Midas asked Silenus, what is the best thing for us? What is the best thing about life? And Silenus says, you don't want to hear the answer, but if you want it, I'll tell it to you anyway. The best thing about life is to not be. The best thing is nothing. And the second best thing is to die as soon as possible. So Nietzsche then says, so how can we contrast this? How do we reconcile, rather, this attitude of folk wisdom with the joyful Apollonian celebration evident in the art and in the Homeric epics? And I think what's going to happen here is that this is basically Nietzsche's response to Schopenhauer. Behind this paragraph here regarding King Midas is the entire edifice of the Schopenhauerian philosophy, where Schopenhauer is the great famous pessimist who says no to life, just as Silenus does here in this fable. He says life is a mistake, it's based on a horror, it is something that should never have been. All it is creatures ripping each other to pieces, and it's based on eternal suffering, and nothing but suffering. That's all it is. And so for him, life is a mistake. Not for Nietzsche. Nietzsche, even though he's inherited this philosophical tradition, is interested in saying yes to life. And keep in mind that this is coming from a man who just got out of combat in the Franco-Prussian War here. So he's seen life at its worst. People ripping each other to pieces. And he still finds a way to say yes. And he does it through this Apollonian celebration of art. Schopenhauer has, we have to get into some aesthetic theory here, the aesthetics of Schopenhauer as well as of James Joyce to really fully understand what's going on here. Schopenhauer has, to this insight, which Nietzsche characterizes as Dionysian, this insight into the dark abyss, that life is based on a horror. You can't be alive on this planet without ripping apart another organism and putting it down your gullet. That's the horror that it's based on. There's no way around that. You can't escape it. So he has two solutions. One is asceticism, and the other is art. With asceticism, he has reference to the tale of Buddha, who sets forth from the palace on 3 consecutive days, where he sees, for the first time, because he's been sheltered his whole life, and he goes outside the palace for the first time and he sees a sick man. Then he sees a man who is dying, and then he sees a corpse. And he says, well, if this is the end of life, I mean, what good is living? That's the Dionysian insight that both Schopenhauer and the King Midas fable evoke. What is the cure then for the mind's penetration into the horror of what existence is based on? So this becomes a problem. And it first became a problem during the Axial Age, Karl Jaspers's Axial Age, which extends from 500 to about 200 BC. And the Buddha came up with a solution. His solution was asceticism, nirvana, detaching oneself inwardly, since all suffering is caused by fear and desire. We're always desiring things and we're afraid of losing them. or afraid of something happening to us. And so nirvana is the attainment of a psychological stance that is based on complete indifference towards suffering. So you're in a stasis, neither fearing nor desiring. So that's the Buddhist solution to this Dionysian dilemma. Schopenhauer's other solution, he says that's one way to go, but not the ideal way. The other solution is through art and through what he calls aesthetic arrest. So he says his worldview is based on willing, and so he agrees with Buddhism that the primary motivations are fear and desire. That's what the will is. It's essentially a manifestation of fear and desire. So how do you stop that? He says the eye is an organ that was evolutionarily evolved to be an extension of the appetites or lust. The eye either looks for a beautiful mate to have sex with and reproduce, or it looks for food. That's what it was designed to do. But he says with aesthetic arrest in art, the eye now is reterritorialized and liberated and cut free from fear or desire. So the proper art, the artistic object, is divinely superfluous. In a sense, when you are beholding a great work of art, you have become willless. You have become the pure subject of the universe beholding the pure object of the universe. And there is no willing relation between the two whatsoever. It's aesthetic arrest. So that's Schopenhauer's two solutions to this problem of the Dionysian misery of life. And then Joyce inherits this and transforms it in a portrait of the artist as a young man, where he says there are two kinds of art: proper art and improper art. Improper art, according to Joyce, is either pornographic or didactic. And by pornographic, he doesn't just mean sexual. He means any kind of art, like advertising is pornographic in his sense. Any type of art that motivates you to move toward and desire the object. So it doesn't have to be just sexual. So that's desire for the object represented. If it's didactic art, as all political art is, then it's trying to get you to be repelled by something. To take up a critical stance or a critical attitude that pushes you away from the object represented. So there we have the Buddhist fear and desire transformed by Joyce into proper versus improper art. Now, so he says, now proper art consists in a kind of aesthetic arrest whereby the work of art that is seen, he borrows from Aquinas three terms: wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Wholeness is when the thing that is seen is that thing which it is and no other thing. So it's got a kind of phase space boundary drawn around it. It's integritas. Wholeness is the Aquinian word for it. And then he says, but it has to have also a fortunate rhythm. The artist has struck a fortunate rhythm. So you've got a harmony there that fascinates, that's aesthetically pleasing. And then radiance is simply the energy, the aura, as Benjamin would call it, I think, the same thing. The aura that just comes through, that radiates through from the beautiful object. So that's Joyce's aesthetics and his transformation of Schopenhauer by combining Schopenhauer with Aquinas. And so what Nietzsche is doing here is setting up the stage for his aesthetic theory that the Greeks created the Apollonian world, the Homeric world of such beauty. And Greek sculpture, let me tell you, if you've never seen Greek sculpture of the 5th century BC, when it was at its apogee, that's something to behold, man. I've never seen sculpture that beautiful ever in my life. So he knows what he's talking about here. Where did the need, he wants to know, where did the need for that beautiful, to create art that's that beautiful, where did that need come from? And he says, it came from the abyss, from the insight, from the Greek insight, as we saw in the Silenus fable, that life is a horror, and it's based on suffering. And so he draws an analogy to Apollo and the Titans, Apollo and Homer, and I take it that by virtue of him talking about the Titans, he's referring to Hesiod's Theogony, which is all about the Titans. And so for him, the victory of the Apollonian is a kind of dragon slayer myth, a victory over Apollo must slay the Dionysian python in order to justify life. As far as Nietzsche is concerned, life is only justified aesthetically, as an aesthetically pleasing thing. That's the great thing that is the celebration of life, that the Greeks heroically accepted life suffering, and then they interposed between that abyss and the human subjectivity who perceives it, this midworld, he says in this chapter, of beauty. Everything everywhere saturated with beauty. That's what the Greeks invented. Their cities, their artwork. Walking through a Greek city must have been like just constantly walking through a museum. The whole thing was an absolute Apollonian, joyful yes to life, not a no. And so for Nietzsche, the Apollonian yes reverses Silenus's idea of the nothing, that the best thing to be would be to die, and reverses it to Achilles' idea, his heroic affirmation of a short life full of deeds is better than a long life with nothing. This life is something to be celebrated through great deeds, through the creation of great art. And I think this is the philosophy of a man who has come... I never read The Birth of Tragedy with this before thinking about him just getting out of the war, probably with PTSD, which explains a lot of his idea here, this Hamlet brooding insight. The problem with Hamlet is that he gets stuck with the no, just as Schopenhauer does. He can't find anything good about life to celebrate it. It has to be celebrated artistically. So Dionysus for Nietzsche in this book, early on. Later he changes it. It's almost as though here in this book, Dionysus is that which is the worst part of life. The book will end actually with an image that Thomas Mann includes in his novel The Magic Mountain, which is drawn a lot from this book. In fact, he even mentions the Magic Mountain in here on page 42. This is the basic writings on page 42, where the Apollonian and the Dionysian is, you see a beautiful temple with Doric columns or Ionic columns, and then you go inside the temple, and in there you see two women sacrificing a baby, ripping it to pieces. That's the Dionysian that the temple's facade has been designed to cover over with the beautiful illusion. This is Maya again, but it's Maya as art, the beautiful illusion that seduces one onward into life instead of rejecting it. So this is his way of rejecting Schopenhauer's rejection of life. And Schopenhauer, it's interesting because Schopenhauer was a spoiled brat. He grew up with rich parents, his father's business. He never had to work a day in his life. He certainly wasn't part of any kind of combat anywhere. He was a spoiled brat. He got everything he wanted, pretty much, I think, and yet still says a bratty no to life, this pessimistic, no, the whole thing's awful. Whereas Nietzsche never really had much. He suffered the horrors of war, was poor and broke and sick all of his life, and still said yes to it through art. That's why I think this is his greatest book. Later, though, the Dionysian, it gets to be a slippery concept, because in some of his later writings, he starts changing the Dionysian to the joyful energies of life. Dionysus becomes no longer just the god of horror and misery in the abyss, in the realm of Hesiod's titanologies, but associated with the joyful in life. The joyful, the intoxication, after all, is pleasant. Dionysus is the god of intoxication. And so there is a blissful side to the Dionysian as well that he'll get into later on. And so we'll get into that in the next chapter.